They're children who are born of the internet. So they're very much kind of children of the modern internet, instantaneous access to information, social media. I think that they're quite an engaged generation, but there's a sort of kind of sense of alienation. And I think one of the really interesting things, is which I'm going to reflect on today, is traditionally people have associated adventurousness with teenagers, this idea of wanderlust, this idea of leaving home and getting out as quickly as possible. And I think to some extent this happened to all of us, but technology, I think, in some ways has made us more insular and inward looking. So particularly in the UK, but I think there's trends that we're seeing all over Europe and kind of the West, where Generation Z, I think, are kind of quite attached to the home. And I think there's lots of kind of complex reasons for that, but I mean ultimately this is the first generation where you can do everything. You can talk to your friends, you can watch films, you can order food, you can see the world without you leaving your bedroom. So I think if I was going to tick off those things, I think those would be the instant definable things about Generation Z. Well, I mean, the interesting thing is every single generation of teenager, their main source of influence outside the sphere of the family and their friends has been brands, advertising, film, ergo Hollywood, television, music, and advertising. And those things have always been the most pervasive and powerful mediums, external mediums in everybody's lives, but they're particularly influential on young people. They've exerted massively how they behave, how they shop, how they think. And basically the internet has replaced those. It is undoubtedly the most powerful and influential force, I think, in most of our lives, but particularly young people's lives. And bearing in mind this is the first generation who have never known a world without the internet. They were born and came of age with the internet. So I think that has, to go back to my point, it's massively changed the way that they shop and they think and they consume. And I don't think they're as influenced by the kind of traditional forces that have been exerted by Hollywood and advertising and branding. So for example, and this is also education, but there's been a huge decline in things like smoking and drinking and global travel and driving and motorcycle riding. Those things that were always sold very easily to teenagers, and I think that's a really easy, accessible example of how that's kind of transformed their everyday lives and their desires. Yeah, I think older people, generally speaking, I mean, I think this is shifting a bit as it becomes really entrenched in our everyday lives. But I think older people generally use social media as a way to reflect their lives, to say, this is my new baby, this is where I went on holiday, this is, me with my new car or whatever. And I think the way Generation Z engage with social media is, and this is another interesting fact of Generation Z, that lots of themselves, it's the way they've evolved, see themselves as brands. We are now living in where any person can become a brand, and social media, sort of the social media stars are the new stars. So I think that Generation Z tend to engage with Instagram or Snapchat or WhatsApp or all the ones they use, but particularly the visual ones, in a way that essentially they're advertising themselves. They're saying to themselves, this is me, and I am valuable. And for the lucky few, but for quite a lot of them, they do become these kind of brands that bigger brands, bigger companies will seek out. So it's a really interesting kind of symbiotic relationship. But I think generally speaking, that's how they engage with social media, as a platform, as opposed to kind of a reflection of their lives. Yeah, I mean, I think that there's sort of both social and political conservatism that you're seeing a lot with young people. Like, as you say, traditionally socialism and lefty kind of like huggy politics probably been associated with young people, and that's what they gravitated towards. And there is obviously lots of young people who still do gravitate towards those, but I think absolutely the right, we're seeing this kind of groovy, like this alt-right, which is seen as this kind of groovy, quite extreme, I think, kind of right that particularly plays out online, and that's really how it really develops. And I think there's obviously reasons why, but I think there is that kind of an appeal to lots of young people, and that does seem appealing. And you're seeing these quite mainstream, quite high-profile figures who are kind of young and cool that lots of people really identify with. And I think you also are seeing some social conservatism. Like, for example, we're seeing the lowest instances of things like teenage pregnancy since the 1960s, the lowest instances like smoking, drinking and recreational drug taking. And certainly I would say that a lot of that is because education's works, and we have very good sort of educations and good resources for young people to access so that they can kind of avoid those things or not do those things or do them responsibly. But I also do think, and this is really interesting, that because young people have such a window into each other's lives by choice, that's the kind of the flip side of social media, that you're constantly also smartphones, that you're constantly putting your life online. But I think the result of that is that you see a lot of them self-policing each other. So when within the kind of the social media framework, I think when there is when people kind of see that somebody's perhaps stepping out the parameters or the norms that they object to, they can tell them on kind of social media shaming, and that's an instantaneous thing. But it's also that thing that they realise that if they do something out of step, it will go on social media, it will spread, they might get bullied of it. So there's also that self-policing thing, and certainly the sober thing. Loads of young people, like teenagers, when you talk to them, one of the reasons that they don't get completely wasted at parties is because they're so worried about this idea of a picture or a film going online and being there forever and ever. And so to some extent we've kind of paparazzied our lives. But I think, the sober thing is great, but what you sometimes have to ask the reasons why it is, and that they're not always for the best reasons. I think the big thing is it's made their job harder, because previously if you wanted to sell a product or sell an idea or sell an ideology, it was very easy to understand where you access that audience that you needed to access. So you'd access them via advertising at the beginning of films or during films or television programmes or magazines, which every generation of teenagers have been really locked into in this one on. So I think the really important thing is for them to understand the social habits, the new social habits of Generation Z. And really, I mean, to conquer that, you have to understand really the online world, because this is a world where they're residents in, they spend almost all their time in. So I think if any kind of company or brand really understands the sort of social media habits and the online habits of Generation Z, they'll begin to understand how to engage with them. But any brand, any successful brand, any brand that's really successful at the moment, absolutely with the thing that unites them is that they've had very successful online campaigns that have gone viral, and they've really understood with how to engage with the things Generation Z are really into, so websites, apps, social media, and also all the underground things that they do as well. The thing that really bothers me at the moment that I would like to see transformed is this really binary thing that everything has to be in opposition. It's male versus female, white versus black, white collar versus blue collar, and this idea that everything's in opposition, and if you're for this thing, you're against that thing. And I think obviously that's manifested in a fairly toxic political environment. It's certainly manifesting in some toxic social environments. And I think this idea of removing this idea that everything has to be oppositional, and if you support one thing it means that you're against this other thing. I really want to remove this idea of a kind of a binary thing and have this idea that there can be a compromise, and it doesn't mean that you have to agree with someone, but disagreeing with someone doesn't mean that you have to then kind of say disparage them or send them death threats, because we've seen that in the discourse all over, and I think it's really trickling down everywhere. And I just want to get back to this idea of some sort of, I don't mean in a hippy-dippy huggy way, but compromise. I think that's quite important for the next year.